Alex, thank you for joining us. I mean, just before we get into the Supreme Leader himself, can you explain a bit about how Iran works in terms of its political system, how all those different bits, the leader, the clerics, the IRGC, how does that actually work in terms of governing society?
Sure. So this Islamic Republic was born in 1979 as a result of a revolution that had many different factions in it. The one faction that sort of came out and prevailed over all the other factions were the Islamists. They were the most organized, and frankly, they were the most willing to use force, essentially, to sort of put all the other opponents aside. So they came about in 1979, 46 years ago. And they have had two pillars in terms of how the system at the hands of the Islamists has run. One are the sort of clerics. You have the role of a supreme leader, has to be a religious person of a senior rank. And then you've had the Revolutionary Guards. These are men in uniform whose role to begin with was to protect the clerics, to make sure their domestic political opponents didn't get to them. The Revolutionary Guards over the last 46 years has seen that kind of a mandate expand from defending the clerics against, domestic opponents to becoming this ideological arm of the regime and really going out there in the world and spreading Khamenei's worldview. And we've seen that in the region, certainly the last decade or so. And what is that Khamenei worldview? Very much a legacy of the Cold War. Khamenei is a product of the sort of Soviet propaganda when it comes to his views on the West. I mean, he still talks in terminology of imperialism. United States is hell-bent on, subjugating peoples around the world and, steal their resources. That's been sort of his mantra for the last 36 years as supreme leader. So he's been willing to sort of fight this fight for the U.S., and he's had the Revolutionary Guards essentially as his, foot soldiers to do it. And for a long time, you could argue it worked, but obviously here we are at the brink of the United States entering this Iranian-Israeli war. And I think if you want to really find the genesis for why we ended up getting to this point, you've got to go back to the worldview of Khamenei and the folks in the Revolutionary Guards who are implementing his worldview for the last few years.
Well, yeah, let's get back to that genesis and let's talk about the genesis of the man himself. You mentioned it a little bit there, the revolution. He was a player within that. He was jailed. He was a supporter of the first supreme leader. Can you tell us a bit about his background and also, that revolutionary history? How much authority those credentials really lend him in terms of his role?
So, yeah, I mean, look, Ali Khamenei was certainly in the inner circle of Ayatollah Khamenei, the founder of the Islamic Republic in 1979, but he wasn't very prominent before then. I mean, it was kind of almost by accident that he ended up in the inner circle. He was young. He didn't have, any kind of significant religious background as such. He came from a poor, impoverished background from the city of Mashhad in the northeast, not from the border with Afghanistan. So he wasn't in Tehran, and he came in 79 when the Shah was fallen. And then sort of, being in that inner circle and having a number of personal traits helped him. One, he's a good speaker. He's always been a good speaker. He happens to be wearing a black turban, which signifies that at least he claims to be a descendant of Prophet Muhammad. So he kind of rises by accident, if you will, but emerges as a candidate that Khomeini decides to have in his inner circle. He's first president from 1981 to 89. Then he takes over the role of supreme leader at the age of only 49. And his sort of appointment as supreme leader was a major surprise to many. He was still young at 49. He was certainly not religiously qualified. In fact, they had to change the constitution because he wasn't an Ayatollah. He was a mid-ranking cleric. But you know what? The fact that he spent so much, both before the revolution and immediately after the revolution, being in the game, but not really having access to the hard power that he wanted, created this personal desire for him to prove everyone wrong, that he had something to bring to the table. So when he actually becomes supreme leader in 1989, he spends a few years maintaining a pretty low profile. He lets the other part of the regime take the center stage, that the sort of state machinery, the technocrats, the government, and so forth. and instead he focuses on building that relationship up with the Revolutionary Guards. So they didn't have much of a relationship before Khamenei became supreme leader, but once he's supreme leader, there's a bond between Khamenei, the man, the supreme leader, who fears what he's seen as legitimate and has enough support in the regime, and the Revolutionary Guards, who had just come out of the Iran-Iraq war. They were equally looking for a mission in life. So they come together, they create this coalition, and they gamble on hard power. So they gamble on developing their hard power at home, and then increasingly over the years, spreading that worldview to the rest of the region, which, as I said before, is exactly the kind of recipe that got us to where we are today in this confrontation between Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards and Israel, backed by the United States.
And yeah, that hard power seems to be crumbling almost in front of our eyes. And that was the strategy, as you say, for so long. I mean, do you think that was always going to be his strategy? And when he came to power, as you say, young, not necessarily having that much authority, almost an accidental supreme leader, accidentally elevated to, you know, that trusted circle. What were his views? As you say, was he just a cold warrior when it came to the West and America? Was it more religiously influenced? What was he coming from, and has those views changed over the years at all?
So he starts off before the revolution kind of leaning very much to the left. I mean, I have written in my book, if Khamenei had not been the son of a common cleric, he might have easily become a communist. He certainly had a lot in terms of his personal background that lent him to, you know, wanting to choose communism as his political calling. But he didn't. He stayed as a cleric. And in the first few years of the sort of post-Shah Iran, when he was president, as I said, from 81 to 89, he was more or less on the pragmatic side of the regime. He wasn't one of the craziest out there. I mean, there are a lot of examples of how, for example, he would speak against, you know, some of the more excessive members of the regime. Now, again, you know, when we look at the totality of the Islamic Republic from a Western point of view, they're all crazies. You could make that argument, but he was certainly a milder version of that when he was president. Famously, he kind of would come out and sort of downplay Khomeini's fatwa against Salman Rushdie. Early on, as supreme leader, he was against Iran getting entangled in what Saddam Hussein did in Kuwait. So, you know, the hardliners in Iran at the time were actually saying we should support Saddam. Khamenei was one of the ones who said, that's too much, we shouldn't do that. But that pragmatic side of Khamenei over the last 36 years when he was supreme leader kind of faded away. And he has become the one single obstacle for Iran reforming its foreign policy. He's the one single obstacle that prevented any kind of serious normalization between U.S. and Iran. Now, he would probably defend himself and say, we tried, we couldn't trust the Americans because the Americans always wanted to bring this Islamic Republic down. But I think his critics would say he didn't try hard enough. And you know, when you look at his sort of doctrine, this anti-Americanism, and certainly his position on Israel, and this idea that he was a leader not just of Iran, in fact, oftentimes you would sort of think he didn't care about Iran as a country. He saw himself as a leader of Muslims all around the world, hence picking up the issue of Palestine as an ideological cause that has always been very close to his heart. So for these reasons, he ended up taking Iranian foreign policy after the Iran-Iraq war in a very different direction that he could have gone, because there were folks in early 1990s who were saying, okay, now the revolution of 1979 has run its course. The country's devastated. The people are tired of us. What do we do? How do we change course? How do we, normalize our foreign policy so our economy can benefit and so on? Khamenei, unfortunately, chose not to go there. And anytime somebody from the regime tried to come in and make the counter argument, it could be Mohammad Khatami, it could be Hassan Rouhani, it could be even Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, he would stop them. He wouldn't let anybody touch the issue of the United States. That was his red line, because he feared that the United States ultimately wanted to bring him down. So for him, from his point of view, normalization meant a loss of his authority. Therefore, he was in the way and willing to pay the price in the sense of hurting Iranian nationals in the process.
We've talked a lot there about the US and the West in sort of general, but what about the belligerent here, which is Israel, although I would say it was acting to defend itself from the imminent threat of a nuclear weapon from Iran, as contentious as all that is. But what about his views on Israel? Obviously, there has been that great rivalry, the antagonism. Iran refers to Israel as the little Satan compared to America's big Satan. And, Khamenei himself, he's made these remarks, time after time. I think last year, October, after the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, he came out saying that Israel wouldn't exist for much longer. Has that always been crucial to his worldview too? Has that been part of the thinking behind his actions?
Not to begin with, he was much more focused on domestic issues in the early 80s. Certainly, they didn't have much time. I mean, they were fighting the war with Iraq. They didn't have much time to sort of engage on the Palestine issue. But we know as early as 1982, the Islamic Republic helps organize and create Hezbollah in Lebanon, later on the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And so as Iran and the revolution settles down, the path that Khamenei chooses is one of supporting, in time, like-minded groups in the Arab world. I mean, in the last few years, we've been referring to them as the axis of resistance, whether Hezbollah in Lebanon or Houthis in Yemen. But if there's one architect behind that, in terms of the ideological vision, not necessarily in terms of how you go about putting uniform on men and give them arm and fund them around the region, that was a job that the Revolutionary Guards did. Famously, Qasem Soleimani, who was killed by the US in 2020, he was one of those original architects behind the idea of a forward defense, that basically Iran should be out there in the region, create these proxies because they could act in defense of Iran, which today's events in the region show hasn't happened. But it was Khamenei ideologically who was sort of supervising this and providing backing. So when you are someone, as Khamenei has pretended to be, an Islamic leader who aspires to create an Islamic civilization, as he says, but you happen to come from Iran, a non-Arab country, a Shia majority country, you have to sort of look for that common ground with the Arab majority in the Middle East and the Sunni majority in the Middle East. What do you look for? Well, I mean, the obvious one is Palestine. So you become the proponent of the Palestinian cause, even though Israel is 1,000 kilometers away and you have no historical animosity with the Israelis or the Jewish people. But that issue of Palestine and fighting Israel, in Khamenei's mind, is how you mobilize support for Iranian leadership in the Islamic world, in the Middle East and then beyond in the Islamic world. That has been his gamble, and he thought he could get away with it. And he has said repeatedly, it's going to be a multi-generational conflict. He has said repeatedly, I won't be there when Israel's defeated, but that is basically his worldview. And then the Israelis, after October 7th, decided that they weren't going to sit there and watch Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards essentially continue that campaign against Israel. And they took the fight to him, first in Lebanon, Syria, and now to Iran itself.
Yeah, I mean, there are two sort of prongs there, aren't there? First of all, supporting or leading in some cases groups like Hezbollah, like Hamas. But then the other side is the nuclear program, and again, hugely contentious issue. On nuclear weapons, what do you think are his views? Of course, there was a fatwa saying, they shouldn't be allowed under Islam. That was the public view of nuclear weapons. At the same time, there are these facilities, one of them still very much intact, the one that can only be reached by US bombers if they do join this war. How much can we trust what he's said in public, and what do you think his views are in private? And again, do you think there's been an evolution there?
Number one, we have to remember the nuclear issue in Iran goes back to the late 1950s when the Shah was there. So it wasn't the Islamic Republic that sort of came up with the idea of Iran having a nuclear program. At some point, they decide on experimenting with weaponization, potentially, which the U.S. intelligence community collectively say they ceased to sort of experiment with back in 2003. As soon as U.S. went into Iraq, they kind of became scared. They were already an axis of evil. They dropped it, but they kept their nuclear program, but mostly as leverage. They've kept it mostly as leverage. I've been covering Iran for 20-some years now. I have never seen proof that they were very close in recent years to weaponize. And I mean, even Secretary General Grossi from the International Atomic Energy Agency and the U.S. national security establishment here as late as just a few months ago said there was no evidence they were weaponizing. The Israelis have a different view. They said they couldn't sit and wait anymore, and obviously they took the decision they took and struck Iran. Whether that is justified or not, that separate issue.
On that, I mean, if Khamenei wasn't there, we'll talk about these threats to remove him. I mean, I suppose you could say the last week has proved that Iran has every reason for wanting a nuclear deterrent, even if you say there hasn't been evidence of that. But no one's attacking North Korea, are they? Or compare it to Libya, where, Gaddafi gave up his weapons and ended up dead in a ditch. A lot of people in Iran, whoever the leader is, however hardline or reformist, will say, well, look, this proves why we need an independent deterrent. And other countries, Turkey might think the same thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, again, Israeli actions in the Middle East are being questioned across the board. A lot of countries are nervous because they think what Israel is doing to Iran with the U.S. support, and by the way, Europeans are basically supporting Israel too, that they could be victims next. Turkey could be, the Saudis could be, Gulf could be. Essentially, that Israel becomes this attacking component of Western powers doing whatever they want in the region. That is a real conversation being had from Ankara to Riyadh and Muscat. That's hardly a secret. But going back to the point of deterrence, look, we could have had a different situation if Khamenei had not adopted the language of Israel has to cease to exist, or the United States has to leave the region. So the belligerent language that Khamenei for so long subscribed to is the reason why the nuclear issue became so sensitive, right? Without that, we have to look at it in the context of the politics of this. It wasn't just a nuclear issue at the hands of just another member state of the United Nations. It was a nation under the control of Ali Khamenei that was speaking a very belligerent language. Certainly if you're Israel, certainly if you're the United States, and certainly if you're the West. That didn't help. And, over the years, I think he made some big mistakes. This whole banking on Russia and China to come and save Iran against the West, that turned out to be a mistaken gamble. Where is Russia today? Where is China today? Are they helping Iran? They've signed all sorts of agreements. I mean, they're supposed to be in alliances in Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS and so on. But when it comes to it, Iran is strategically alone. A few years ago, the Iranians decided to supply the Russians with drones and missiles at a time when they could have decided, actually, we shouldn't do that. That will irritate the Europeans. We need the Europeans to remain sympathetic to Iran on the nuclear issue. They did the opposite. They irritated the Europeans.
And obviously that leadership, Khamenei right at the top of it. I mean, the US allegedly, according to reports, vetoed an Israeli plan to assassinate him. It seems well within their capabilities given what has happened so far. And actually, Donald Trump saying we know where he is not perhaps that reassuring for him. That would be, I mean, that's what Iranian media have said. It would be incendiary if that happened. Even those threats are intolerable. How much of a crisis would it be if he were assassinated, whether by Israel or the US?
So first, I make the point that having watched this crisis unfold for the last 6 days, it's really hard not to come to the conclusion that President Trump knew all along what Israel was doing, that this has been in the planning for months. In fact, Israeli media are talking about how the Israelis, together with Trump, pulled off the great deception, that they were pretending that they were going to have talks last Sunday in Oman. The Iranians had their guards down, and then suddenly Israel attacked. So, there's been a lot more U.S. involvement in this war pre the conflict, during the conflict, and probably post-conflict. I don't subscribe to the notion that, President Trump is being dragged along. I think he knew what was happening all along. On the issue of whether killing Ali Khamenei will make much of a difference, look, very few people in Iran will miss him. In fact, if the death of Ali Khamenei is going to be the one factor you need to bring this war to a quick end, I bet you a vast majority, 90+% in Iran would say, let's do it, because the nation needs to survive. The nation can't take any more punches coming its way from Israel and perhaps from the United States. Nobody cares about Khamenei, and I know that there's a lot of now concerns being expressed because Ayatollah Ali Sistani in Iraq in the last couple of days specifically has said killing Khamenei would be crossing a red line. What does it mean? Does it mean Sistani in Iraq, where millions of Shias will, issue some kind of a fatwa and saying, not take the war to the Americans, including American military personnel in Iraq, Western interest in general? Speculation on my part, but clearly Sistani is saying, don't kill Ali Khamenei. There are other options. If this war is going to be ended, I mean, Khamenei could do the decent thing from the perspective of many, get on a plane and fly to Moscow, where his friend Vladimir Putin might put him up next to Bashar Assad. That's another scenario. But I don't know if we can assume that the death of Khamenei necessarily is going to make things much worse. What I think is more likely to happen is if the bulk of the regime that's fighting right now feel that they have no future, regardless of what happens to Khamenei. In other words, if Israel, United States, the Iranian opposition that's waiting on the sidelines to go in, if they can give that bulk of the Iranian regime, including forces that are serving the Revolutionary Guards, a way out, they would probably take that, I assume, as opposed to dying or seeking martyrdom just because Khamenei has been eliminated. Khamenei's 86 years old. He probably thinks martyrdom is the best thing that could happen to him at this point. That will be his historic legacy, right? But I don't think necessarily the bulk of what's left of this regime, its leadership, that's what they want, martyrdom. They probably, presumably, I think, would put their own personal, physical well-being first. And even come to this conclusion, something they should have done a long time ago, that they've lost their own people. That the fact that the Iranian people are not concerned about the well-being of the regime is because it's a regime that's been treating them so badly for so long. So the regime falling is not going to be missed by, again, a vast majority of Iranians.
I mean, regime change is something that has been talked about, including by, Israeli politicians too. Khamenei aside, his life, his well-being, but if there is an attempt at regime change, is that when things become more dangerous? As you say, the leaders in charge, fearing for their lives, their well-being, go to desperate lengths. And then is it just a mess? If it does work, even if it does work, what comes after it?
So, Tom, the quick answer to that is nobody knows. So the proponents of regime change will say it's a hated regime. As soon as you get rid of it, something much better will replace it. Those who are skeptical point to Iraq, point to Syria, point to Libya, point to years of American investment and Western investment in general in nation building that didn't result in much good, and are raising the alarm, saying if regime change is going to happen, it's not going to come through military intervention from outside. It has to be done politically by activating a Iranian opposition that we know exists in Iran, maybe link it up with the Iranian opposition that exists in diaspora, put them together and hope for some kind of a transition to the extent possible, peaceful system to emerge after the Islamic has collapsed. But this notion that some folks have had that, you attack Iran, people of Iran are going to rise up and replace the regime, that is not that realistic. When they are fleeing the city of Tehran, following the orders of Israel, they're not going to have the capacity to sort of mobilize politically. That's not what a place is. Again, we have lots of scenarios to look at. Syria, Libya, Iraq, you name it. So many failed states that have emerged in the Middle East over the last couple of decades. Iran could be just another example of that, or it could prove the trend wrong. It could actually turn into a transition that goes from religious dictatorship to something much better without bloodshed, but it requires planning. It requires deep thinking. And that's my concern. Living here in Washington, D.C., I don't see the creative thinking. I don't see the Iranian opposition getting ready, training for taking over. And when I compare this to the period before the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, the U.S. and Europe, including the United Kingdom, spent a year plus planning for post-Saddam Iraq and still got it badly wrong. And here we are looking at Iran, the country that's 3 times the size of Iraq, twice the population of Iraq, much more complicated in many ways. And where is the planning? That's my concern. That's my concern. I don't think anybody's going to fear or miss Khamenei or it's his regime. That absolutely not the case. What they fear is anarchy. And it's not just the Iranian people who fear that, it's the entire region that fears that.
Let's do a different scenario. Let's talk through perhaps a more hopeful scenario, especially from the European perspective, because they're working for a diplomatic solution for this conflict to come to an end. If that is the case, and Iran goes on as it is under Khamenei's leadership and the current regime, more or less, as you say, he's 86 years old. When he eventually dies, who do you think his successor will be, and how do you think that will shape or reshape Iran over the years to come?
It's really difficult to say what would happen, because we have to remember this Islamic Republic and this whole idea of a supreme leadership, these are man-made concepts. There's nothing in the Quran or in religious Islamic text that creates justification for a role called supreme leader. It was created in 1979. Only two men have had the position, and there's been a healthy debate inside of Iran in recent years, questioning the use of a supreme leadership. It's essentially, it has so much power vested in one man that it amounts to a dictatorship. So people have been asking for this role to be abolished. And the departure of Khamenei, regardless of how it happens, departure of Khamenei is an opportunity for Iran as a country to sort of have a hard conversation and say, you know what? The name of the country is Islamic Republic. The Islamic part, in the shape of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and Khomeini before him, for half a century dominated the system. And look where they brought us to. They haven't done much good for the Iranian people. Maybe we should drop the Islamic part. Maybe we should turn religion into something that individuals who want to practice the religion can do so in the private space. But in terms of politics of the future, let's focus on the Republican part. And take it from there. Now, I'm not sitting here and advocating for a Republican system. I'm saying that's one option. There are folks who have, nostalgia for Iran before 1979. The supporters of Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, they have an agenda. They think they can lead the nation into something much better going forward. They surely should have their voices heard, but there is a question mark whether they can get a majority of Iranians to back them up. But I think the notion that you have diaspora leadership right now waiting to go into Tehran and take over without any involvement of folks who have been serving in the regime, who might defect in the future, that seems unrealistic. I think the best scenario you can imagine are members of this regime, again, including folks who have been serving in the Revolutionary Guards, but who have come to conclude this regime's run its course, teaming up with a very capable and energetic Iranian diaspora opposition, and together they can maybe steer the nation forward. And again, that would be the best scenario, particularly for Europeans. I mean, imagine an Iran in chaos. Just imagine the potential flow of refugees. And Iran gone, that means you will have anarchy in a country that's 3 times the size of France, that is no longer going to be that wall that keeps, for example, Afghan refugees and migrants away as they seek to go to Europe. So there's a lot at stake here, not just for the Iranian people, not just for the immediate Middle East, but also countries further away in Europe.
I mean, yeah, what you're talking about, potentially momentous changes, as you say, not just for Iran, Israel, and the Middle East, but also wider, momentous times right now we're living and seeing on our screens. Alex, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Tom.